Welcome to Teaching 8th Grade U.S. History. This is session 8, and it's March 22nd. So, oh my gosh, we're almost to April. We are going to take a look today at the next unit in the course. This one is going to focus on the Civil War. So let's dive right in. I am Molly Gale. I'm a social studies consultant at Oakland Schools, and my two colleagues could not be here tonight, but they are Stacy Woodward and Christopher Lee. So I'm just going to put up a couple of norms and commitments and give you a chance to take a look at them to yourself and choose just one or two to focus on today as we work through this session together. Okay, so hopefully you've picked out one or two just to keep in mind as we move today. And as our connector today, I'm going to ask you to take a look at the unit graphic organizer, and I just want you to reflect to yourself, which photos do you recognize? What in here looks familiar? And then which photos do you still have questions about? So I'll give you a minute to think about those. Which do you recognize and which photos do you have questions about? And just think to yourself, what might those questions be? And as we move through the session today, I think you'll see that many of these, you'll recognize them in the lessons as we go through the units. So just a reminder of where we are right now. We have worked our way through units 1 through 7. So when we last met, the unit focused on the time period right before the Civil War, and students looked at why the Civil War broke out when it did. Today, we are going to take a look at Unit 8, which focuses on the Civil War. And the question that students are pursuing is, how should we remember the Civil War today? So I want to give you a little bit of a framing for this unit, which I know I usually do, to let you know what we were thinking about as we created this unit. So again, the compelling question is focusing on how should we remember the Civil War today? So students have to think not only about what we should remember, but how we should remember it. This unit is taking place over the course of 2 weeks, which you might be thinking to yourself, oh my gosh, that seems really fast for the Civil War. The Civil War traditionally is taught over a longer period of time. But as we talked about in our very first session this year, we were very intentional about setting up the pacing guide to allot for 6 weeks of Reconstruction at the end of the year. We feel strongly that that's a pivotal time period for students to understand, not only as they move into high school U.S. history, but in order to understand what's going on in our country today and society today. So over the course of 2 weeks, these were some of the things we were thinking about as we crafted that unit. One was, how do we condense this kind of traditional study of the Civil War into a smaller time period, but yet still address Michigan standards? We, of course, were able to do that, which you're going to see the product today. Another thing we thought about was not only making sure we hit the standards, but how could we make those standards relevant to what is going on in the country today? So we strove to make some connections for students to contemporary U.S. society. We wanted to give kids a chance, of course, to analyze key people, key events, and key issues from the Civil War era. We also did not want to do a deep dive on every battle, and we were cognizant of that. We didn't want this to be a memorize every battle unit, but we did want to make sure we highlighted several battles and gave kids a chance to understand what occurred in them. Another thing we focused on was continued Black resistance during the Civil War, which students have looked at over the course of the year so far. And last but not least, we wanted to continue to build students' disciplinary reading, writing, and thinking skills. That's something we've paid attention to in every unit, and we made a really conscious effort in this unit to continue doing that. So this is the product of that. So the compelling question, how should we remember the Civil War today? You can see there are 7 lessons. They really work their way in a somewhat chronological order from the beginning of the war to the end. In the first lesson, students look at whether the Union or the Confederacy had the greater advantage at the start of the war. They then move into looking at why it took so long for the Union to win the war. In that lesson, they have a chance to look at some battles in the first couple of years of the war and to think about why the Union wasn't winning everything decisively. In lesson 3, they shift their attention to people's lives. So they look at how did the Civil War affect people's lives during the war, and they look at a variety of groups of people. In lesson 4, students look at how did Black resistance endure during the Civil War. And then in lesson 5, they move into a view of political leadership. And specifically, they look at how political leadership helps to win a war. In lesson 6, the students investigate the question, how did the Civil War redefine America in 1864 and 65? So looking at those final 2 years of the war, what was redefined in America that really, and we'll talk about this in a minute, but some really notable shifts occurred. And in lesson 7, they have a chance to make a contemporary connection to a relevant current issue. What guidelines should communities follow as they determine what to do with existing Confederate monuments? Okay, so let's dive in. I'm going to walk you through a guided tour of the unit so you can get a feel for what students are doing in each of these lessons and what resources they're working with. So lesson 1, students take up the question, did the Union or Confederacy have the greater advantage at the start of the war? In order to do this, we start by having students analyze a quote from Ken Burns. And I'll give you a second to read that on the screen. And after they've started thinking about this idea of the Civil War as being a really important thing to understand in terms of understanding how the country works, we have them watch a short video clip from Ken Burns again about lessons from the Civil War. And students are paying attention to the question, how did the Union both win and lose the Civil War? So it gives them a chance to frame the Civil War a little differently than maybe they've heard about it before. In lesson 1, students receive the graphic organizer that they'll use over the course of the unit to track that unit compelling question. In order for students to think about how we should remember the Civil War today, we wanted to give them a framework for thinking about whether an event or a topic is historically significant, as you can see. And then we give them a chance in every lesson to take that lesson question and to think about what we should remember about that lesson's topic. And students have a chance to think about all of those 5 factors of historical significance. At the end of the unit, students come back and answer, how should we remember the Civil War today? Students next recall some prior knowledge they have about the geographical breakdown of the country. So students have a chance to think about what states were part of the Union, what states were part of the Confederacy, and they look at the border states again and think about what were the border states and, of course, reviewing that they fought with the Union. Then students look at the goals of the war, the demographics of each side, the economic resources, technology resources, military strategy, and they look at political leadership as well. So students take a look at who had the advantage and disadvantage at the beginning of the war. In order to do this, students do have a graphic organizer to help them work through this. There is a teacher guide provided with that graphic organizer filled in to help you scaffold students. They look at charts and graphs as well as infographics, looking at both the demographics of the Union and Confederacy and the economics of the Union and Confederacy. These are just a couple of them there to give you an idea. And these are so interesting, really fascinating for kids to dig into. Next, students take a look at the Union military strategy, and to do that, they engage with an Esri geo-inquiry. So students use this interactive geo-inquiry to really visualize what the Union military strategy was, and I think it helps them understand ultimately why it did lead to success for the Union, but also why it was challenging. Next, we give the students a little bit of direct instruction about presidential leadership, and then we transition to have them look at military leadership. They begin by looking at a short video clip about General McClellan, who of course was general for the Union, and they examine a telegram that McClellan wrote to Abraham Lincoln, and it gives them a little insight into McClellan and who he was. Then we have students look at a video clip of Robert E. Lee, and we ask them to think about what may be distorted or romanticized in that video clip. And then they read an excerpt from The Atlantic called The Myth of the Kindly General Lee. And then we ask students to think about what they read in that article about those myths surrounding Lee and to go back to the video clip and to critique it. And this lesson ends with a barometer discussion, which students have done in previous units as well. This is where students stand along the continuum, where they think about who had the greater advantage at the start of the war, the Union or the Confederacy, or maybe they stand somewhere in between, and it gives them a chance to really gather their thoughts before they form an argument to that lesson question. So in lesson 2, students have a little framing now. And the question that really is before them is, it doesn't seem like it should have taken the Union 4 years to win this war. So why did it take so long? So the first thing we ask students to do as they pursue this question of why did it take so long for the Union to win the war, we ask them to come up with 4 questions they have about that. Again, we're putting this idea of questioning as really important to the classes and as important to the process of learning. Then what students do is they really walk through what I would call a crash course of Civil War battles in the first couple of years of the war. Now, we show them this map in the lesson, and they are able to see very quickly that there's a lot of battles. In fact, there's 176, and there's over 10,000 engagements. And it becomes very clear that they are not going to be able to go through every battle, and they're certainly not going to be able to memorize everything about every battle. The next thing we do is we just want to make sure students understand that some battles are called by multiple names. So in the Union, sometimes, and not all battles, but some battles have one name that the Union gave it and another that the Confederacy gave it. A famous example of that is the Battle of Antietam, which in the Confederacy was referred to as the Battle of Sharpsburg. And students may see both names in documents, so we wanted to be clear about that. Then what we do is we give kids a chance to watch this really interesting and engaging animated map. So this animated map, which is really, it's a video that animates what occurred over the course of the first couple of years of the war from the American Battlefield Trust. And as students watch this animated map, they think about the question, why did it take so long for the Union to win the war? And they record evidence for that lesson question while they watch. We do also include suggested evidence in the teacher sequence. So sort of how to scaffold students to pull out key evidence, and you certainly can pause the video and give kids a chance to record at intervals what they're learning. When students have finished that, they take part in a Socratic circle, and they really take up this question of, like, why did it take so long? Because the Union is not winning every battle at the start of the war. We also asked them to think about the advantages and the disadvantages of that animated map as a source. At the end of the lesson, students read another excerpt from The Atlantic. This one focuses on, it's called 150 Years of Misunderstanding the Civil War. And what it's really looking at is the romanticizing of Civil War battles and military strategy. And it takes a look at that, why that has happened and how that has happened. We asked students prior to the end of this lesson, there's an extension activity, so it's of course completely optional, but we included an extension activity where students look at some then and now photographs from Gettysburg. They're really interesting. They take the historical photo and they show the current laid next to it, so you can really see the then and now and how the battlefield has shifted. And we asked them to think about historic battlefield preservation and what its goals are, what its challenges are, and the significance of that in our national story. And of course, the American Battlefield Trust, which was the source that provided the animated map video, does work toward historical preservation. So that gives kids a little more context about that realm of the discipline. So in lesson 3, students begin to look at people's lives, and they think about the impact of the Civil War on people's lives. It begins with students just understanding the difference between a combatant and a civilian, which is important to understand as they look at different groups of people. And then they have just a really brief introduction into Civil War photography, because they're going to look at some photographs, and it's important to know how it worked. And for instance, if the subject had to stay still for 2 to 10 seconds, what things could and could not be captured. The students then head into a station activity. In order to guide them through this station activity as they're rotating, they have a graphic organizer where they write the station topic. They write down anything they learned from the background information at the station, and then they do some sourcing and some close reading of the source. And finally, they talk about what generalization they can construct about that topic. So these are the 10 station topics, and students do not visit all 10. They choose 5. So students get to pick which of these 5 are most interesting to them, and they rotate through 5 stations. Each station has both background information and one or more sources. So this is an example of one. For Soldiers' Letters Home, students have some background information. They watch a short video about soldiers' lives. This again is from the Ken Burns Civil War documentary. And then they actually read the letter that was written by the soldier to his wife. They add evidence to the graphic organizer as they go. Again, we do provide a teacher guide that has a completed graphic organizer so you can better support students. And when students finish, they've rotated through the stations in pairs. They find another pair and form a group of 4, and they share the generalizations that they came up with. And students can, therefore, while they only visited 5 stations, they actually get to hear about some of the other stations as well, and to hear what the generalizations were about the war's impact on those groups of people. Lesson 4, the question is, how did Black resistance endure during the Civil War? Students start by brainstorming what sources might help them answer that question, and they classify those sources. Some things students might say, soldiers' letters, diaries, newspaper accounts. Students then also review, this looks familiar likely from a prior unit, students review Lincoln's evolving viewpoints on emancipation and racial equality. And that then leads them into learning about the Emancipation Proclamation. They learn what the proclamation did, and they consider the ways that Black people resisted prior to the Emancipation Proclamation, as well as the way the Emancipation Proclamation encouraged resistance to continue in new ways. So they look at what was occurring before it, and then the way the Emancipation Proclamation impacted resistance. They also think about Lincoln's motivations for freeing enslaved people in Confederate states that were not under Union control when he did. Students next watch a National Geographic video clip that looks at the impact of the Emancipation Proclamation on Black resistance. And then they dive into an envelope activity where each of the 4 envelopes that they encounter has a source or a set of sources that helps them look at a different type of resistance. They have a graphic organizer, again, to help them as they gather evidence. There is, again, a teacher guide provided, so this is filled in for you. And the 4 different envelopes, one has a video, a painting, and a photo. One has a letter and a muster roll. One is an excerpt from Smithsonian Magazine, and one has telegrams. So just to give you kind of a visual of what students are looking at in each of these envelopes, you have envelope 1, envelope 2, envelope 3, and envelope 4. So again, students are looking at a variety of different sources. Students at the end of this activity, I'll just go back for a second, they discuss the findings with a partner from another group, and they return to the lesson question and write an argument to the lesson question. And then we, of course, give them a chance to add some extra evidence to their unit graphic organizer. Lesson 5 focuses on political leadership. And the question is, how does political leadership help win a war? And in this case, students are particularly focusing on Lincoln's political leadership. Before they dig into this lesson, they have a chance to pause and look at their working claims to the unit compelling question about how we should remember the Civil War today. And they have a chance to share those working claims and to think about them and get some feedback. Then as students dive into this lesson question, they start by looking at presidential rankings. And what they notice is that in current presidential rankings, there's general agreement among experts that Lincoln's leadership played a critical role in the Union victory and the future path of the nation. And they think about, okay, if historians are generally rating him as very effective, why? Why did political leadership help to win the war? Students have a graphic organizer to help them think about the different things that Lincoln did, the different aspects of his political leadership. You can see one of them was the Emancipation Proclamation, which they have some prior knowledge on from the last lesson. And the next one we look at is the telegraph. Students watch a short video clip about the telegraph and how he used it to benefit the Union during the war. And they also read, this time, a telegram from Lincoln to General McClellan. Students next look at the suspension of habeas corpus, and they consider why that was controversial at the time and arguably controversial today. Before students next look at political speeches, which the Battle of Gettysburg clearly preceded the Gettysburg Address. So before students can dig into the Gettysburg Address, they do need to learn a little bit about the Battle of Gettysburg. So they learn what occurred, how the Union won, and why it's considered the turning point of the Civil War. That sets them up to be able to really do a deep dive on the Gettysburg Address. The first time the students encounter it, they just listen to it being read aloud. There is a read aloud provided in the MC3 unit, or you alternatively can read it aloud to your students. As they do, they pull out any vocabulary that's confusing, and then they use context clues to try to decipher what those words mean. For those that can't figure out, they look them up. Now, in the lesson sequence, we do provide a list of words that I think could very likely be words students pull out, as well as their context and or their definition. Then students do a close read of the Gettysburg Address with a partner, and they summarize Lincoln's message in their own words. And you'll notice it does it section by section. So it really chunks the text for students and allows them to dive deeply into the speech. Students think about these questions after their close read. For instance, why does Lincoln refer to the Declaration of Independence in the first sentence? How does he honor the fallen soldiers? Cite evidence. So at the end of day one, students have really started to grapple with the Gettysburg Address. When they come in on day two, they start by listening to it read aloud one more time. And this time they listen to the video clip from Ken Burns in the classroom. After students have really had this understanding of the Gettysburg Address and why it mattered, we next have them look at another piece of Lincoln's political writing, which was his second inaugural. In order to understand the second inaugural, we set students up with the context for his inaugural. And we give them some key points about what was going on in the country and what was happening when Lincoln got ready to write and give the speech. Then we ask them, what would they have said if given that context? And we have them write their own inaugural address for Lincoln. Then students examine the purpose of the second inaugural. They listen to it, and they engage with the text with close reading questions. So again, as they're listening, they're able to do some close reading questions as well. Then we ask students to take Lincoln's second inaugural and compare it to their own. Where did they match up? Where didn't they? What are they noticing? Students then watch a short video clip about the significance of that speech of the second inaugural. Gives them a chance to synthesize a little more. And one thing that video clip talks about is an encounter that Frederick Douglass and Lincoln had after the second inaugural. That event that they refer to in the video, we then have students read a short excerpt from the Life and Times of Frederick Douglass, which was written by Frederick Douglass, where he talks about that encounter. And we ask students to go back after they've read that excerpt from Douglass and to do some corroboration. So we ask them what was in that primary source that was not in the video clip, and we have them read across read across sources. As always, students come back to the lesson question at the end, and they add evidence to their unit graphic organizers. So lesson 6, we're in the final 2 years of the war, and the question students take up is, how did the Civil War redefine America in 1864 and 1865? As an example of what that means to redefine, We give them this idea that even language changed. So the United States prior to 1865 was considered a confederation of states, whereas after the Civil War, it was considered a single country. And that's a big shift. We asked students to brainstorm other changes they think occurred, and then they use the give one, get one strategy to share that prior knowledge with classmates and to learn about their classmates' prior knowledge. In this lesson, students again have a graphic organizer to help them gather what occurred in 1864 and 65 and how that redefined America. The areas they're looking at in this lesson are warfare and technology, freedom, and casualties. They begin by reading an article about the final years of the war, and you can see it's titled Grant Takes Command, and we have them create headlines for different chunks of the text. Then they watch a clip from The Story of Us that further addresses warfare and military technology and how that redefined America. Students then learn about Juneteenth, and they learn about what freedom meant for 4 million enslaved people. They watch an interview with Dr. Annette Gordon-Reed, who talks about Juneteenth. And we have students brainstorm questions that the country will now have to address in terms of what freedom meant post-Civil War. Finally, students look at the human cost of the war, and they draw conclusions about how that loss redefined America. There is an extension in this lesson that allows students to create tweets that convey their messages, and then to post those in the classroom. That again is an optional extension. And finally, at the end of this lesson, students synthesize what they've learned so far in lessons 1 through 6. And they create an outline for an argument about why the Union won the Civil War. So at this point, students say, okay, we know the Union won. Why did it win? And they create a claim with evidence and reasoning. And we give kids a chance to really work through this argument. And this is really giving them a chance to synthesize. If you were going to add a day to this unit, this would be a great area if you wanted to add extra time for students to really have a chance to dig into this idea and to think back and review what they've learned so far before they head into the final lesson of the unit. That final lesson is a contemporary connection. The question is, what guidelines should communities follow as they determine what to do with existing Confederate monuments? You'll notice the question is not whether existing Confederate monuments should be pulled down or not. We're not asking students to take up that debate. We're asking students what guidelines communities should follow as they determine what to do with existing Confederate monuments. Students start by doing a See, Think, Wonder about 2 photographs of the Robert E. Lee statue in Richmond, Virginia, which you can see here. We also provide an aerial view so students can visualize where that statue is located in Richmond. They listen to a poem about creating a brave space, and they determine which commitment they will focus on over the course of this discussion. We ask students to go back and think about this infographic that they've already seen this year, and to recall prior knowledge about Confederate iconography. So again, this is a chance for them to bring that learning forward and to think about it now in the context of this unit. They then do a quick write for about 3 minutes where they look at current social media posts about removing Confederate statues and memorials. And we let them reflect and think about that. And then we give them their task, which is to co-create a set of guidelines that we could give to communities to follow as they figure out what to do with existing Confederate monuments. The text we have kids grapple with in this lesson is the AHA, the American Historical Association Statement on Confederate Monuments. This statement, of course, is written by historians, so it's giving that disciplinary lens. In order to understand that statement, we give students the context of it, which was the Unite the Right rally in Charlottesville, Virginia in 2017. And then students use the document analysis sheet from the National Archives to really look through that statement on Confederate memorials and to see what they can learn from it. Then students engage in another Socratic seminar, and you can see the questions are really great that they're going to take up in this. What role does context play in building a memorial? What role does geography play in building a memorial? We give them a couple of quotes too. You can't change history, but you can learn from it. Is that true? All memorials remain artifacts of their time and place. What does that mean? Then students pull back together and they co-create a set of guidelines for communities to follow as they figure out what to do with existing Confederate monuments. As they build those, they write them on chart paper around the room, and then the class takes part in a gallery walk, and they discuss which they thought were most helpful, and they consider how they might be able to use those to take civic action. And again, of course, at the end of the lesson, students come back to that unit compelling question one more time, where they really start to grapple with how should we remember the Civil War today. In the summative performance tasks, students craft an argument to that unit compelling question. We give some suggestions, as we always do. Their argument might be written. It could be a podcast. It could be designing a memorial for the Civil War. It could be a historical marker. It could be a mural. So a variety of options. The extension that's provided is to curate a collage of Civil War photographs that capture how we should remember the Civil War, and then to give a short oral presentation to convey the reasoning for their choice of photos. And hopefully you're remembering now that unit graphic organizer, which was similar. To take informed action, we ask students to find historical sites that preserve the memory of the Civil War today. Those might be battlefields, they might be homes, they might be buildings, and to think about what they're preserving and how they're conveying historical memory. And then we want students to think about an area of Civil War history that is not currently being preserved or shared that they think is important to remember, and then to create a plan to preserve and highlight that area of Civil War history, and then to present their plan to an appropriate body, depending on their selection. So you can see this is a robust unit. I think it's an exciting unit to teach. So 2 weeks, it's a great deep dive on the Civil War, and it's giving kids some really big ideas and issues to grapple with. Oh my gosh, and I can't believe we're already done. So just a reminder, our next Zoom meeting is Wednesday, April 19th from 7 to 8 p.m. on Zoom. So that's a different time than usual. We're doing this one as a check-in on the Unit 9 reconstruction unit. Those of you who were able to make it this past Monday, we had our in-person full day workshop with Facing History and Ourselves about Unit 9. Which addresses reconstruction. And the April 19th Zoom is a chance to follow up on that, to check in about how it's going, or to take some questions that you have now that you've had time to think about it. However, even if you were not able to make it to our in-person day on March 20th, we would love to see you at this Zoom on April 19th to learn about the unit and to hear how it's going for people. So hopefully we'll see you April 19th at 7 p.m. Our final session of the year will be Monday, May 22nd from 4:30 to 5:30, where we will address the final unit of the course, which is Unit 10. As always, if you have any questions, please don't hesitate to reach out. My email is there for you. I'm happy to help in any way I can. Thanks, and have a great night.